Today we have with us Bhasha, an artist whose work focuses on political and social structures. She is deeply involved in using the metaphor of mending in her work to explore these themes. Hi Bhasha, welcome to Listening to the Shades. We're really glad to have you on with us. Could you just introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name is Bhasha Chakrabarti. I'm an artist, sort of living and working currently out of New Haven in Connecticut. But I'm born and raised in Hawaii, and I've grown up in various places. Well, that's not true. I grew up in Hawaii, but I have lived in various places since, including in New York, in Delhi, and now in Connecticut.
Ah, great. Could you talk a little bit about the thematic focus of your work?
Yeah, sure. My practice kind of really focuses on the relationship between cloth and the human body, and thinking about textile as a sort of container and metaphor for human relationships and human history, and the ways in which we negotiate each other and the world around us through cloth. And whether that be through the wearing of cloth or the making of cloth, the production of cloth, or the distribution of cloth, the ways in which cloth moves around the world. And also that in a big way ends up including the way in which cloth as a medium and a material and as a sort of discipline, I guess, has existed within the arts. And where it's been used and highlighted, and who's held that knowledge. And so ultimately, I'm also thinking about cloth and fabric as in relationship to knowledge and what we consider to be important knowledge, what we consider to be, who we consider to be good knowers, and how we can call those sort of existing power structures in the world into question through these sort of thoughts and explorations.
You said right now that cloth connects us to human history and you use it as a medium to explore that. Could you give me an example of that or explain what kind of draws you to textile, particularly to do those things instead of, say, archives or other mediums?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that I'm more interested in textile than other mediums. I think I'm rather interested in the way in which cloth can act as a lens into other mediums and the sort of ubiquity of cloth, I guess, which to me is quite a unique material in our life, in the sense that um, everybody comes into interface with cloth, basically, and that goes back very, very far. And this idea of something cloth being something that's touching us constantly, and something that is covering our body, and then eventually something that we as humans begin to produce and begin to think about, all different ways in which to sort of refine that. But then it also is something through which we're building shelter. It's something through which we're creating art.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's sort of this one material that crosses between many worlds, and many sort of aspects of society and human life, from the everyday to the sort of very special ritual occasions, to the very like high culture and elite spaces. So what are the ways in which I think there's very few mediums or materials, I guess, that sort of cross
Yeah.
across intersect across every aspect of human life, and is constantly interfacing with the body. It's not something that's meant to be sort of from afar. And in the moments that it is meant to be something from afar, there's a very special reason for that, and that makes us feel very special in some way because it's not usual to how cloth otherwise functions. I hope that makes sense.
Definitely, yeah, that's like really interesting. I've also noticed that oftentimes you'll use like local materials and local textiles when you're talking about, specific regions. Can you talk a little bit more about the process of, discovering or coming to that? And how does that kind of help you ground your practice in the global south, for example, or, talk about this very specific power structures?
Yeah, I think that sometimes I used to tell this narrative as like, because I grew up in Hawaii, but on the other hand, I think the special thing about cloth is that no matter where you grew up, there is a very specific story with cloth and fabric to that place. Whether that's what kinds of clothes are worn, whether that's what kind of materials are grown, whether it's how those crafts or techniques came to be, or whether it's, the current day politics of clothing and fabric and production and all those kinds of things. And so I think it actually, in that sense, is another reason why I'm so interested in it, is that it's simultaneously ubiquitous and universal, and yet it's hyper specific to very specific places. And so one can dive really, really deep into it and yet be immediately using that depth to start making connections outwards. And that's always been something very important to me. I think that does have to do with sort of having grown up in an island and in a place that is very geographically isolated, especially as a sort of diasporic person who's not of that place. And so there was constantly this need and desire to both connect outwards, but to also feel that where I was had everything in it. It was the whole world, And so there was this like simultaneously going in and going out. And I think that what learning about fabric has taught me is that, or being interested in it has taught me, is that that sort of that distinction that people make between knowing something really deeply versus knowing something really widely is actually a sort of false distinction, because the more you delve into something in depth, the more connections you start to make. And you start to realize that everything is connected. And so there's this kind of feeling of, even if I just start with like a sort of sweatshirt that I have on right now, and I start to think about the story of that sweatshirt, how does that slowly unravel an entire sort of history that connects like every place in the world, and like, it starts to become this thing that is so much bigger than what one initially thought. And I think that's also particularly interesting to me because fabric is something that both my parents are academics, and so I grew up sort of in the world of the university and of academia, and with a sort of not an understanding, but surrounded in this world of like of knowing that there was this thing called knowledge that was really important, and I really I value that as an upbringing, and yet that also from a really young age made me question a lot of things, like why were certain things considered important knowledge and certain things were considered not so important. And cloth and clothing, let's say, or fabric, always kind of in a traditional narrative falls into the category of like not serious
Mm-hmm.
knowledge, right? Whether one thinks, especially in the contemporary discourse, I think if one thinks of it as like fashion
Yeah.
or like how someone dresses, like
Yeah.
those things are considered superficial, right? And I, from a very young age, was very interested in cloth. And so I was always trying to sort of justify that in these academic terms. And I think that process of trying to justify it is what started to make me realize that, wait, this thing is, there are these power structures that have determined
Yeah.
what's important and what's not important. And those power structures, and with cloth, you know, those things are tied, of course, to gender in a
Yeah.
big way, but also to sites of production and sites of places where cloth has traditionally been made, people that it's traditionally been made by, and often this sort of the contemporary devaluing of fabric is a very like Western sort of construct, because if you look at South Asia, for example,
Yeah.
and it doesn't have to be South Asia. It can be China, it can be Africa, it can be Southeast Asia. There's lots of places. But and I mean, even Europe, actually, fabric was an expertise and knowledge in fabric was considered one of the highest and most
Yeah.
sort of sophisticated forms of knowledge.
Definitely.
And so that sort of shift into suddenly thinking it's superficial, or thinking thinking that it's frivolous or that it's not important or whatever, that shift is really interesting to me as well. And so I think those are the kinds of different sites that I'm trying, those are the places that I'm revisiting constantly through thinking about cloth, and yeah, through this aspect of like thinking of the hyper local as the global
That
connector.
that makes a lot of sense. It's really nice to think about. Um, yeah, you also mentioned how cloth and textile is really connected to the sites of production and the people that produce it. So does that kind of lead into the conversation about like labor and, you know, how cloth moves around the world both after it's worn, before it's worn?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the kind of world we live in now, most commodities, one could probably tell a narrative of this, especially, I mean, in the US,
Yeah.
where like almost nothing is manufactured and made anymore. There's like one place where the material is being harvested or mined, then there's another place where it's being assembled and produced, and then there's another place that it's being designed and distributed. And so that's I think that's a narrative that we're able to understand really clearly now. But what's interesting about fabric is that it's sort of historically, um, back into sort of ancient times, been something that's been crossing the seas, and been something that's been sort of coming from great distances. And that sort of knowledge exchange, but also commodity exchange, has been happening. And as a result, there's been this sort of both a valuing and an undervaluing, and both a sort of understanding, but also a mystique around the labor and production of it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's what has made it one of the primary sort of powerhouses into exploitation. And that's what
Yeah.
makes it really easy to become a site of exploitation, because it has this simultaneous sort of something from far away that I don't know that much about,
Yeah.
something that I can build a fantasy around, and that and yet something that's very like daily and practical. And so like there's this weird dichotomy that's always existed in fabric production as a result, which I think is quite interesting. Like even if you look back into like fairy tales, you know, and this is something I've been really interested in recently. I've been trying to think more about it, is like different sort of mythology. It's crazy how much mythology and fairy tales in different countries and different cultures are based around like different aspects of fabric production. So whether that be sort of spinning, you know, this idea of spinning, or like weaving
Yeah.
or dyeing, like all these things of like you know, biblical stories, like the Technicolor coat, like there's these like all these different narratives around fabric, and it's something that one can build a story around. And I'm interested in how um, both those stories can be sites of possibility and sites of like richness, but also they can become these sort of covers for they can begin to cover an obscure sort of exploitation and actual real life experience, and whether the historical sort of major narratives around cloth production,
Yeah.
obviously the biggest ones being around like cotton
Yeah.
slavery in the US, indigo
Mm-hmm.
plantations and cotton production in India, silk production in China. Like all these narratives are really, really tied in with histories of exploitation. And so how something can be simultaneously sort of fantastical and yet really bodily exploitative. Yeah, that dichotomy, I think, is something that's really needs to be explored, especially given that it's a material that we're like touching constantly.
Yeah.
How is it that we're able to still be so fantastical about it?
That makes a lot of sense. Do you think do you think the fact that it has this kind of mystique around it, but there is also like simultaneously exploitation, is something to do with like colonial history? I'm thinking about this in terms of art, but oftentimes cultural objects that were taken from colonies were then resold or like were then retold in, those other countries. So do you think cloth and textile also traveled that way?
Yeah, it absolutely did. I think the reason I was starting to mention mythology and fairy tales and stuff is kind of to state that this is a characteristic of cloth that very much predates colonialism as well.
Fair.
This idea of it being a space of sort of exploitation or of fantasy,
Yeah.
of something coming from far away.
Mm-hmm.
It's something that very much predates colonialism. And yet, I think the unique aspect and the sort of uniquely exploitative aspect of colonialism is, of course, scale, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that this idea of, and that's like sort of capitalism. And so if one thinks of colonialism as the sort of start of the engine to capitalism as we know it today, and growth industry production and
Yeah.
scales of production as we know it today, yeah, absolutely. I think that the ways in which we relate to cloth today, and the ways in which cloth is produced today, has a lot more to do with um, colonial structures and colonial exploitation and colonial extraction as than it has to do with like anything pre-colonial. And I think that that's sort of why it's difficult to think of the fabric as something that's always kind of been a site of
Yeah.
exploitation and mythology, because the scale at which it's happening now is directly sort of changed and formed by colonial history. But yeah, but I am interested in it. Sort of, is there something inherently within cloth that sort of has this dichotomy in it?
Yeah, that makes sense. What like do you think mythology has done, or how has mythology changed or influenced the way we think about cloth? Even if you can't see it very explicitly right now, but like still as it exists within those structures and has kind of ballooned because of the colonial influence.
Um, that's a complicated question. Yeah, I think
Yeah.
that's a little bit of what I'm trying to um figure out. I mean, one answer to that for me is everything, right? Like the answer to that is tied to everything,
Yeah.
and everything that's happened. And for me, it's like I'll start pulling like one thread, and then it'll like the whole thing will begin to unravel. But I think uh like I was mentioning sort of earlier, I think what's interesting to me is that cloth on the one hand is something so daily and
Yeah.
ordinary, and something that you're touching constantly, something that um, everyone knows, everyone uses. Like there's nothing special about it in terms of compared to like, I don't know, jewels or gold or something, like
Yeah.
something
Yeah.
that feels um, inaccessible. Cloth is not inaccessible inherently. Of course, there are inaccessible types of cloth, but one has the inaccessible cloth has a lot more to do um, or has a lot in common with our daily sort of fabric, and everyone kind of knows and understands that. And yet um, one has always been mm, one has always been fantasizing about it. And I think to me that is connected to um, the sort of sensory
Yeah.
experience of cloth, and the fact that fabric is something that is not just visual, um, but also something tactile, and that it can directly affect the body
Yeah.
and the way in which the body feels.
Uh-huh.
And so that automatically it's not just going to change the way the body appears, but it's also going to change the way in which you feel within your body. And that sort of experiential sensory aspect of it makes it something so desirable. And I think the moment you add in an extra sense, so I mean, I think this is another reason that, I mean, you think about colonialism as a phenomena that was
Yeah.
sort of driven primarily by spices and cotton.
Mm-hmm.
And both of them are like quite frivolous if you think about the actual value, quote unquote,
Mm-hmm.
in terms of um, yeah, I mean, like, who would think that just to like make your food taste better, you're gonna like go and oppress like an entire half of the world, or just because like you want like a nicer shirt or whatever. And so if you think of it on those terms, it's
Yeah.
really crazy because it's literally just for taste and touch. And so it's like that's how motivate. And I think that that's the point at which I start to question these sort of modern, Western, whatever we want to call it, hierarchies of knowledge and value, where people are like, oh, like these are frivolous things. It's like,
Yeah.
no, they're not frivolous things. These are the things that are like driving human society. Like people are so like went so crazy over how soft like this cotton was, or how shiny this silk was, or how tasty this pepper was,
Yeah.
that they were willing to sort of like take these immense risks and then like compromise their like, you know, values and you like turn into like sort of monsters for this. And so that to me, yeah, that, and that I feel like that narrative was kind of told of these things being frivolous, to sort of keep the people that had that knowledge and that had those resources at hand, to keep them from feeling powerful. And that is sort of the consistent narrative that one feels, I think, in all forms of power and exploitation in the world, where it's like, you're like, oh, there's like a bunch of people who don't have, I mean, whatever, I don't have a lot of money and I'm going to be told that like having lots of money is what's going to make me happy, you know, and therefore in that process I start to like give up all these other things which perhaps were actually the thing that made me happy, and that's because the people that already have all the money already know that like that's not the thing that's going to make you happy, you know. So it's like this crazy yeah, so I don't know where I went with that, but yeah.
No, that is quite interesting to think about. Especially the fact that like it was in fact cloth and spices that caused mass amounts of human destruction. This is a little bit of a departure, but you did talk about how, you know, knowledge about cloth and textile and those kinds of things has always been considered unimportant. And there is just like it's obviously associated with gender. So how do you feel about the way that, like, how do you feel about your practice and how it fits into that kind of puzzle, especially given that even right now the people who are considered to have knowledge about fabric and about textile are most of the time not women, because in the West at least, and it is more centered around, you know, people, for example, who are like head designers at like fashion houses. Most people are men, for example.
Yeah, this is a very complicated question, I think, again, because the more I understand and unravel, the more I wonder about what it means to have a practice that's and what it means to have a practice that's about highlighting these things that have kind of been unknown, because I think I think we'll start with like resistance to a major power structure has always existed, right? So like there's always been oppressive forces, and we can use gender, for example, as an easy example. So let's say women have always been told that they're not knowledgeable, they're not creative, they're whatever. And in every culture, let's say. And yet there's always been both public resistance to that. So there's like things like, I don't know, in the US, let's say, there's been things like the suffragettes, and there's been like these outspoken people that are fighting for women's rights, and simultaneously there have been people who let's say are resisting within their own homes, right? Or within their own lives through their daily practice. And those quiet forms of resistance are often what narratives of textile hold. There are, of course, and I've worked a lot with like the louder ones, the louder forms of resistance that have happened through textiles, and whether that's like cotton growth or indigo plantation or whatever. But I'm interested in those more quiet sort of spaces, right? And what does it mean to then begin to highlight it? So I'll give like two examples. Like one, let's say with Gatha. Gantha quilting, which has been like a sort of an aspect of my practice that I've always been really interested in. My dad's family is Bengali, and so I grew up with the Gantha and sort of with this relationship of knowing what it is and wanting to kind of be involved with it and wanting to understand how it is that these women in my dad's family who like hadn't were basically illiterate almost, they were most of them, were still making these sort of elaborate ganthas, right? And they were like really, really beautiful, and they were never allowed to leave the house. They had like all these restrictions. They were very much within this sort of patriarchal structure, and yet they, if you look at these sort of works of art, basically, you see that there's no way that someone can call this person not like powerful or not intelligent or not creative. And so that form of resistance is something that I really wanted to like work with, you know? And so, and I was at one point really interested in how like why wasn't Gantha something that was being used more? Like this was early, like 20 years ago. I was thinking about like, oh, like why isn't it a thing in fashion? Like why isn't it, you know, like these kinds of things. And then of course that's changed and that's become more and more, Gantha has become like sort of this like trendy, let's say in India at least, or even now in the States, you have like a lot of brands and stuff using it. And when I was about 10 years ago, when I was doing research for a little more than 10 years ago now, oh my gosh, in my undergrad, I was doing research for my thesis. I did political science and economics in my undergraduate, and I was doing it specifically on handlooms. And the political economy of handloom in India. And at that time, I was working with Fab India for some research. And I was looking at their looms in Bengal, but simultaneously in some of the villages, they were doing Gantha production. And what was really interesting to me is that the moment that Gantha became something that was like valued and viable in the economic market, it was taken away from the women and it was all the men that started doing it. And now if you go to like a place where they do like large scale Gantha production, mostly, unless it's like some sort of an NGO, it's very clearly being done by men. And so that shift of like, oh, now we see Gantha as something valuable, we see it as something beautiful, like fashionable, whatever, expensive, that unfortunately doesn't take the people with it. And so I think those are the moments in which like I think one needs to start to remove the sort of divide between the craft and like what it means to begin to value the craft versus are we valuing the people that were making that craft. And I think that's the point that I start to ask questions, because that's the case with embroidery and textile generally. I think now in the arts, in fine art, for example, like one can't even have like a conversation being like, oh, like oil painting is so much more of an art form than textile, because like everyone, like textile is the trendiest, coolest thing in contemporary, right? Like everyone wants a textile piece and every artist works with textiles and whatever. But has that actually translated in the way in which the rhetoric around it is supposed to have translated? Like, are we actually valuing the work being done in domestic spaces, the work being done by women outside of the economy and outside of economic exchange? Are we actually valuing that more? Or are we just like taking this way of making away from that group of people? And that is what kind of makes me worry. And sometimes that's also why I'm constantly in my own practice going back and forth between quilting and painting and all these other forms, because I want to be really clear with myself and with sort of everyone that textile exists in all these forms and always has.
Yeah.
And it's not about me saying that like, oh, look, quilts are beautiful, we should all think they're beautiful. It's more like, why don't we have a more intentional relationship with fabric, and with fabric in every form, in the way in which it exists around us? And I think until we start to do that, if we're just going to be having these conversations around like medium, or around like, if I hear one more narrative about like my grandmother's quilt, like I'm gonna like fall over and die. Like I was like, I cannot, like I don't care about your grandma. Like I don't at all. Like what I care about is like, who do you and who are you placing value in? Um, and not what are the narratives that you're telling necessarily, like where are your actions going, and who is your work like actually benefiting? And those are the questions I think that are harder to ask, and they're harder to solve for. I think in the West there is still, I actually think this is a bigger problem in India. I think in the West there is actually, and that's because in the West they don't have as rich of like a textile tradition.
Yeah.
I think there is like a strong association between like women and fashion, and like industry leaders and all that kind of thing. But I think in India, because there's like such a long-standing tradition of like karigars and textile weavers and things like that as a profession that has been done by men, like a professionalized aspect of garment production, that's a lot richer and more diverse and complicated. I think that in India there's like a longer way to go, because there's also a lot more layers of like like class and valuing, and I think that it's a really important question to think about, like, why is it that I'll say a quilt that I make, okay, like a gantha, let's say I make a gantha and my gallery sells it. Why would that go for a certain price? And a gantha that even, let's say, a man made it or whatever, but like a gantha that's made by someone in a village for sale, why is that a different price? And like, what is that tension? And I think that is a really important question to ask and always keep in mind.
I think that maybe this has something to do with, like, again, what you were talking about earlier, which is how visible is the labor and how much can you see what goes into it. You talked about
how much are you willing to see?
How
much are you willing to see and like wanting to?
Definitely. And you talked about how craft is like taken out of domestic spaces as soon as you see value in it. And I've noticed, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think a lot of your work actually does center domestic spaces. So I'm thinking about like the red room in Karvat, or like a lot of your work has imagery of beds and like women in leisure. So is that like a conscious choice that relates back to this, or is that you're trying to connect it to that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that what was really important, the show that you're talking about with the red room and stuff, this last show that I had called Garbat, that show was in a lot of ways, the whole show was a show about the short story Lihaf, which means quilt. I mean, the whole show was about quilts, and the whole exhibition was about quilt and quilting and the ways in which quilts and quilting has played an important aspect, an important role in my artistic journey. And yet I made a really conscious choice to not have an actual quilt in that show, even though I make quilts as like a part of my practice, but I didn't have a single like quilt in the show. But the whole show was about that. And that's kind of yes, exactly. That's exactly what I was trying to do. I was trying to say that, like, look, there's this whole, the quilt isn't just about the quilt. It's about like this context, and it's about the Red Room, for example, was about Ragmala paintings, which is like far from domestic in terms of art historical discourse, right? Or in terms of what one thinks of when one thinks of Dagmara paintings or Dag music or anything.
Yeah.
One doesn't think of like a domestic space. And yet for me, it was like, okay, what would it mean to make a show about quilts and have the central work about it be about like the most classical sort of art form? And so that's how I'm trying to like sort of question and call into question like what are the ways in which the quilt is classical and what are the ways in which the classical is domestic, and like how are these spaces informing each other constantly.
Yeah.
So that's kind of, yeah, that was kind of the move.
That's really, really beautiful. Just to wrap this up a little bit, what have you been currently working on and focusing on in your practice?
A couple of things. Yeah, immediately as my show opened in Bombay, and then from then I was sort of in Goa doing a residency for a few months and 4 months, and in that residency I was working on a body of work that I've been researching for a few years now, which have to do with the sea actually and the ocean, and that is also in a way connected to it's very connected. My interest in the sea and the ocean kind of begins in my practice by all these sort of projects that I've done around textile trade and textile production. And I had done a show a few years ago on indigo. And in that show, I was really interested in doing, there's a lot of research on indigo in the colonial period, but there's very little information and research, even though one knows that it was really widely traded and all that in the pre-colonial period. And the majority of information about pre-colonial textile trade and stuff like that all comes from like shipwrecks and basically being able to find a shipwreck. And because there's not that much written documentation, so you find a shipwreck and then you see what was on that ship, and they once in a while, you know, find a shipwreck from like 1st century BC or something like that, and then they're able to like pull it up and like see what was on it. And the unfortunate thing is, of course, like cloth is the first thing to disintegrate, and so I was sort of really interested in these sort of incomplete journeys along the sea. I grew up going to this beach that was a big surfing beach in Hawaii called Barber's Point. And Barber's Point is named after this captain, Henry Barber. I found out on accident in like the archives at Yale, which is in New Haven, which is where I was doing research on something else. Anyways, it's really crazy. I found this like captain's journal of this guy, Henry Barber, whose ship wrecked at Barber's Point, which is like crazy because I was like, oh my god, this is a beach that I grew up going to. And that ship journal was here in New Haven because he is from Connecticut. But the ship used to basically carry textiles from Bengal to China, and then pick up textiles in China, trade some Indian textiles in China, and then bring those textiles to the United States. And so there was this like and the ship used to stop on its way in Hawaii. And so it was crazy to me to have this like ship that was taking this Bengal, Hawaii, Connecticut sort of route. And I became really interested sort of in the seas and in these like sort of incomplete journeys and the ways, like what are the information that's been lost in that, but also what's the information that's sort of been betrayed and revealed to us that sort of betray the overall narrative that we hear about. And through that process, I became interested in ships generally. And so I kind of started this project around ship breaking and looking at ship breaking yards. And so last year not last year, but the year before last now, 2023, I had spent a couple of weeks in Chittagong in Bangladesh, which has a really large ship breaking yard. And then this time I went to Alang in Gujarat, where they do ship breaking. And I'm kind of interested in the ways in which these massive vessels that are made to like move these commodities, because like 90% of the world's commodities still move by ship, which like people don't realize. Like I think people think like things are flown around, but they're not. And these massive things are like finally broken in these three places, like either in Pakistan, in India, or in Bangladesh, all from all over the world. And they, as in that process of breaking, it's sort of this impossible task of labor and of environmental impact, and what are the things that are sort of betrayed about these structures of production to us in that process. So I was kind of really interested in this shipping project, and that's kind of been my most recent, and I've been wrapping that up slash nothing ever finishes, everything's like put on hold, and then I start working on something else. So I've started the next project already, but that was sort of the most recent one. The next project is looking at the relationship between music and musical improvisation and textiles, and what are the relationships between songs and weaving, songs and quilting, and the ways in which we compose a musical composition versus a textile composition, and sort of the rhythmic aspects of fabric. Yeah, so all kinds of things happening.
That all sounds really lovely and really interesting. Yeah, that was about it. Thank you so much.
Of course.